Okay, so in the last part we were talking about CBT and therapeutic approaches to depression, and I asked you to reflect for a few minutes on other kinds of therapy that might allow clients to explore their issues in more depth than often happens in CBT, which, remember, CBT tends to revolve around getting people to monitor their negative thoughts and challenge them. What it doesn't tend to do in any great depth is get people to reflect on where those thoughts are coming from, what patterns have established in their life to lead them to have those negative thoughts. Well, if you look again at the NICE guidelines, it does give you some clues as to some of the possible answers. So the NICE guidelines say that for people with depression who decline an antidepressant, CBT, interpersonal therapy, behavioural activation and behavioural couples therapy, consider. So what that first sentence is saying is only if people don't want any of these other things, then consider giving them counselling or short-term psychodynamic psychotherapy, but discuss with people the uncertainty of the effectiveness of counselling and psychodynamic therapy in treating depression. So the reason they say that last sentence is because in their eyes there isn't good, strong evidence to support things like a short psychodynamic approach for depression. The problem there, of course, is that a psychodynamic approach is exactly, or counselling in fact, is exactly the type of work that allows an individual to talk about their issues in therapy as it applies to them as an individual. So those two approaches do not lend themselves to homogenization and standardization, and therefore traditionally there haven't been huge clinical trials done of those kinds of approaches. But going back to what we were saying before, it's exactly those kinds of approaches that might enable people to look at their own particular unique circumstances. What is it about my early experience in childhood that's led me to be at increased risk of having negative thoughts about myself and becoming depressed? But as we pointed out here, NICE basically say you've got to have had the other stuff and refused it before you can be allowed to have these, and if you get these, your therapist has got to say, well, you can have brief psychodynamic therapy, but I have to tell you there's not very good evidence for it and it might not work. Well, that's obviously going to enthuse people, isn't it, and make them feel very confident in what you're about to offer them. Okay, moving on then. I just want to move on to a different condition this time to make a few points about a different mental disorder. We've spoken about depression up to this point, but we could talk about other aspects of mental health, and in particular schizophrenia, which is another major type of mental illness. So like depression, there's a theory based on dopamine, which comes about from the fact that there are pharmaceutical treatments that appear to interact with the dopamine system. Originally chlorpromazine, for example, was a major treatment which affects the dopamine system. And there are many similar compounds now. There's been lots of other drugs developed over the years that work in a similar way to chlorpromazine and that alter the dopaminergic system. In this instance, it's an excess of dopamine that's thought to be the problem. Schizophrenia is a label, but actually there are clearly different types of schizophrenia, and the types tend to be based on symptoms again, just like depression. So for example, there's a type which is mainly around paranoia, paranoid schizophrenia, people that have delusions that other people are against them. And there are other types that are more to do with hallucinatory symptoms, in particular auditory hallucinations. And just like with depression, these symptoms have been a key focus in psychiatry over the years, in diagnosing people and then trying to understand their condition. And this aspect of auditory hallucinations was the subject of a study some years ago. It's a famous study done by Dan Rosenhan, and he wanted to show how easily people could get diagnosed with mental illness just based on this symptom of auditory hallucinations. So he had some participants present themselves to a psychiatric hospital and complain about hearing voices. And so, for example, the pseudo patients, people pretending to be patients, arrived at the admissions office complaining that they had been hearing voices. Asked what the voices said, they replied that they were often unclear, but as far as they could tell they were empty, hollow and thud. So the voices are not actually saying anything very much at all, just empty, hollow and thud. And that the voices are unfamiliar, they're not people they recognise. And what they found was that many of these pseudo patients end up being hospitalised and thought to be potentially schizophrenic. Once they were admitted, they were told to behave completely normally, but having been admitted, they were typically in hospital for 7 to 52 days. They basically just sat there and waited and said, yeah, I feel fine, and they behaved normally. Once they were admitted, they didn't claim that they were hearing any voices anymore. And it took between 7 to 52 days before they were discharged. So that study just illustrates that view about voices, and if you claim to hear voices, you are at risk of ending up with that diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now we know actually from more recent work that actually a lot of people hear voices, including a lot of people that have never had a psychiatric diagnosis. And there is this thing called the Hearing Voices Network, for example, that supports people that hear voices and that advocates on behalf of people that hear voices. If you want to get some insight into what it's like being schizophrenic and experiencing schizophrenia, there is a link here which you can connect to from the PowerPoint slides used in this presentation, which can be quite interesting and insightful. So a couple of other important critiques of the psychiatric view around schizophrenia. R.D. Laing, famous psychiatrist from the 60s and 70s, talked about how people in their development get tied in knots quite often from their developmental environment. This is where parents give you mixed messages. So in essence, you can't really win. So if your parents say you need to do better at school, you're not trying hard enough, then when you try hard enough, they say, well, you're failing, you're not doing well enough. So even though you've tried harder, you're still not achieving enough for them, and so on. So you get tied in a knot. You can't win. R.D. Laing wrote a book called Knots, in fact, to describe that process. Which obviously, that's a very nurture view of mental illness, as opposed to that more medical model biological view. And then Thomas Satz wrote several books actually about the myth of mental illness and about how people got misdiagnosed and, in his view, hospitalised when he didn't think they were mentally ill at all. We know that historically, for example, young mothers who had children out of wedlock could find themselves sent to a psychiatric hospital because they were deemed to have been morally deficient. Satz describes how historically a lot of wives who were seen to be troublesome to their husbands might end up with a psychiatric diagnosis and be put away. Some more recent take on this is from people within the British Psychological Society, who have put forward a thing called the Power Threat Meaning Framework to again describe how in people's lives, where as children they may have experienced people with power, i.e. their caregivers, may have been quite threatening, may have actually traumatised them, and their attempt to extract meaning from that and to cope with it, to deal with it, explains how they develop mental illness. So again, this is another sort of counter to the mainstream biological medical model in terms of a more nurturance as opposed to nature explanation of mental illness. And this takes us right back, really, doesn't it, to the very outset of psychotherapy. You may know there was a big controversy at the start of Freud's career when he went to a conference in 1895 and presented a paper, actually in 1896, presented a paper at a conference in Vienna called The Etiology of Hysteria, and he argued that from a sample of 18 patients that he had treated, their neuroses and hysteria was due to the fact that they had been sexually assaulted by various caretakers. So Freud clearly had this view that early trauma could lead to mental health issues, and unfortunately it seems that Freud got such a negative reaction to this paper that he was quite traumatized by it, and he then came away and eventually changed his view and decided that actually these patients were talking about fantasy. It's interesting to reflect, isn't it, that all these years later we pretty much come back around to where Freud started out from. So the key points I want to make then, again from this last section, are that the biological, this is key points going across the whole of the 4 presentations that I've done today. So first of all, the biological hypotheses are based on how drugs are used in treatment and how they work, rather than a real biological understanding of the actual mechanisms underlying mental illness. So the analogy I've used here, it's like having a theory about why a computer crashes based on the fact that we fix it by turning it on and off again. In reality, we're not going to understand much about why the computer fixed just from the fact that we can how the computer crashes just from the fact we can fix it by turning it on and off. In the past, there may have been insufficient attention to the nurture side of the equation. The medical model has tended to veer more towards the sort of biological explanation, the neurochemical. That may have detracted from psychological views theorizing in treatments. The current psychological treatments that are dominant, such as cognitive behaviour therapy, may be quite limited due to the fact that they are following the medical model. They are psychological treatments that are easily standardized and homogenized, which is what you need for pushing them through clinical trials. And Freud may well have been right in his early 1895-6 theories about early traumatization and its impact later on mental health and well-being. Some point for reflection then at the end of this section. If we were going to have a fully psychologically informed approach to mental well-being, what would that look like? Okay, thanks for your time, folks.